what is known as Baal and the dragon. As we know, Baal comes from Baal, and they both mean Lord. So if we were to translate the title that has been given to this chapter, would be the Lord and the Dragon. So verse 1 says, and King Astyages was gathered to his father, and Cyrus of Persia received his kingdom. And Daniel conversed with the king, and was honored above all his friends. As we know from the book of Daniel, the Persian kingdom was the one, empire was the one who conquered Babylon. And Daniel was the main wise guy in the positive sense next to the king of Babylon, and then became the main of the wise men in the Persian kingdom. It says, and Daniel conversed with the king and was honored above all his friends. Now, the Babylonians had an idol called Baal. It is because of Baal that many universities, states, companies like Taco Bell use the Baal as a symbol. So the Baal is a symbol of Baal, who is Baal, who they worship as the Lord. That is why also in the Catholic Church they use a bell to call people to go and worship Baal. So Baal is Baal, is Satan, is Halel, and is worshipped nowadays as the Lord. When people praise the Lord, they don't know most of the time. Well, what I mean is that some of them know, but just a few. Some of them don't care. They think it's the same. But most don't really know that when they worship the Lord, they are actually worshiping the same entity that also Israelites would worship instead of Yahweh. So now the Babylonians had an idol called Baal, and there were spent upon him every day 12 great measures of fine flour, and 40 sheep, and 6 vessels of wine. So there was an idol which cannot eat, of course, but the king would spend all of this on it as if the idol was feeding himself from all of this sheep and wine. So, and the king worshipped it and went daily to adore it. It is interesting that we see here that the Babylonians worship that entity. We just read that Cyrus came into power, which we read in Isaiah 45 that Yahweh calls Cyrus his anointed one as Messiah. Well, that is what Messiah means. So now we are seeing here how Cyrus was following a false entity, and then through Daniel gets to know the true Elohim. Just like the last, who comes as the prodigal son, as if he were a Gentile, just like Cyrus, eventually comes to know that the one he was worshiping was actually Baal, the Lord, and not the true Elohim Yahweh. So the king worshipped it and went daily to adore it, but Daniel worshipped his own Elohim. And the king said unto him, why dost not thou worship Baal? Who answered and said, because I may not worship idols made with hands, but the living Elohim, El Chai, who hath created the heavens and the earth, and hath sovereignty over all flesh. So plain and simple, Daniel didn't care, in a good way of course, about what the king would think regarding his belief. What I mean is, many people would try to hide their words or their true beliefs in front of a person who believes in a different entity, trying not to hurt his feelings, trying not to enter into a debate. Here we're talking about Daniel and a king. A king had the authority to kill anybody if anybody hurt their feelings. Obviously, this king was a wise king and not, and he wouldn't act in that way. So that's why also we see that Daniel, who by being of the father and also of course wise, wouldn't hide the truth about idols just because the king was following the idol. What Daniel said could make the king feel dumb. That is my point, and some kings would kill anybody for it. But Daniel is not afraid to say the truth because it is what it is. So he clearly says, I should not worship idols who are made with hands. Instead, he worships the living Elohim, the true Elohim, who made everything that exists. So, who answered and said, because I may not worship idols made with hands, but the living Elohim who had created the heavens and the earth, and had sovereignty over all flesh. Then said the king unto him, thinkest thou not that Baal is a living Elohim? Seest thou not how much he eateth and drinketh every day? At least was the version I found, because the version I had got lost with the don't you see how much he eats and drinks every day? Then Daniel smiled and said, O king, be not deceived, for this is but clay within. So he smiled, not mocking the king, of course, but being once again honest, sincere. He smiled as talking with a child who doesn't really understand what he's saying. Then Daniel smiled and said, O king, be not deceived, for this is but clay within, and brass without, and did never eat or drink anything. So the king was wroth and called for his priests. He wasn't angry at Daniel for showing how dumb he was being in the spiritual area of his life. He was angry because of the fact that the priests were making a fool of him. So the king was wroth and called for his priests, and said unto them, If ye tell me not who this is that devoureth these expenses, ye shall die. If you don't tell me who's the one devouring all of these expenses, ye shall die. But if you can certify me that Baal devoureth them, then Daniel shall die, for he has spoken blasphemy against Baal. Obviously, if Baal was an actual living Elohim, then Daniel should be punished. So that's why the king is saying this. But if you can certify me that Baal devours all those expenses, then Daniel shall die, for he has spoken blasphemy against Baal, against the Lord. And Daniel said unto the king, Let it be according to thy word. He was not afraid, of course, because he knew the truth. Now the priests of Baal were 70, beside their wives and children. And the king went with Daniel into the temple of Baal. It's very important, because the priests were fooling the king, obviously, knowingly, and there were many of them. So not only were they many priests, but they also had wives and children which needed to be fed. So the priests, instead of doing something for their lives, they would fool the king in order for the king to give all of this food to the idol, and then they would eat it themselves. So Daniel was pretty much playing with their livelihood of what they would think, just like people who sell idols to fool people, sadly. So now the priests of Baal were 70, beside their wives and children. 70 priests represents all the nations. When Yahweh divided the nations, when he confused the tongues in the time of the Tower of Babel, which was the first Babylon. Babylon actually comes from the word Babel in Hebrew, and Babel means confusion, because there Yahweh confused the languages into 70. And that's why originally there were 70 nations. So even though there are many countries nowadays, they all are represented by the number 70. So 70 is the number of the nations of the world, and there were 70 priests, which represents how all the nations of the world are following Baal, the Lord, the Elohim of this world, a false entity, through different doctrines, of course. Now the priests of Baal were 70 beside their wives and children, and the king went with Daniel into the temple of Baal. Baal's priests said, "Lo, we go out." So I also, just in case I mentioned the word Lord, would be because that is the actual replacement of the word Baal for English, of course. So the priests of the Lord, and I say like that also so that we can see how it fits nowadays, how the priests of the Lord are the ones stealing from the people through their idols. And even if they don't have a physical idol, money is their idol. The image that they have in their mind of what they call Jesus, that's an idol. Because even if you don't have an image of Jesus in the church, the image of Jesus is in their heads when they pray, is the same image, and is not at all how the Messiah looks, and of course is not even his name. So the whole image and name of Jesus is false. So it is a false Messiah, and that is very dangerous. So the priests of Baal said, "See, we go out, but thou, O king, set on the meat and make ready the wine, and shut the door fast and seal it with your own signet." So they said, "We're gonna go, you put everything here, all the food and everything, and then close the door with your ring so that nobody can open it. And tomorrow when you come in, if you find not that the Lord has eaten all, we will suffer death, or else Daniel that speaks falsely against us. So, and tomorrow when you come in, if you find not that the Lord has eaten up all, we will suffer death, or else Daniel that speaks falsely against us." And they little regarded it, for under the table they had made an entrance, whereby they enter it continually and consume those things. So they thought they were going to be able to fool the king once again, because they had an entrance hidden under the table. So when the king would go out, close the door and seal it with his ring, they would enter from the under the table and eat everything, then go out under the table, and they were expecting the king to enter again and see that everything was gone, and then think, of course, Baal ate it. So it says, "So when they were gone forth, the king set meats before the Lord, Baal. Now Daniel had commanded his servants to bring ashes, and those they threw throughout all the temple in the presence of the king alone." So they scattered the ashes around the floor in the presence of the king. Then they went out and shut the door and sealed it with the king's signet, and so departed. Now in the night came the priests with their wives and children, as they would always do, and ate and drank all of it. In the morning the king arose, and Daniel with him. And the king said, "Daniel, are the seals whole?" And he said, "Yeah, O king, they are whole." Meaning no one had entered through the door. No one had broken the seal that was made with the king's signet. And as soon as he had opened the door, the king looked upon the table and cried with a loud voice, "Great art thou, O Lord, and with thee is no deceit at all." Then Daniel laughed and hailed the king that he should not go in. So he stopped the king so that he wouldn't go in through the door, so that he could see beforehand the floor where he had scattered the ashes. Then Daniel laughed and held the king that he should not go in, and said, Behold now the pavement, and mark well whose footsteps are these. And the king said, I see the footsteps of men, women, and children. And the king was angry, and took the priests with their wives and children, who showed him the secret doors where they came in, and consumed such things as were upon the table. Therefore the king slew them, and delivered the Lord into Daniel's power. He delivered the idol Baal into Daniel's power, who destroyed him and his temple. So after the king realized that he was being fooled by the priests, he gave all authority to Daniel over the Lord and his temple, and therefore he destroyed it. Just like Yahweh will give all power to Messiah so that he may destroy Satan and all his temples in this world. And in that same place there was a great dragon. This is very important, and perhaps one of the reasons why they took out this chapter from the scriptures, because people think that dragons are a matter of mythology. They think it's fantasy. They don't understand that what nowadays they call dinosaurs, back in the day were called dragons. Plus, they don't understand that Yahweh made dragons and they appear in Genesis. So they were not on earth millions of years ago, but instead they were on earth with humans, as there is proof also, yet they don't show that, those fossils where they have the footsteps of men and dinosaurs right beside it. So we see in scriptures that they existed with men. Obviously there were more of them before the flood. After the flood, everything changed when it comes to the air that we breathe. So dinosaurs were not able to continue living as they used to, but there were one or two around, scattered around the world, that some would find and keep, as in this case, as if it were a god. So it says, and in that same place there was a great dragon which they of Babylon worshipped. Once again, so they worshipped the Lord and the dragon, which is a representation of two Satans, like the three that I mentioned earlier. In this case, it would be as nowadays they worship God and Jesus. There are false names that actually refer to Satan, Samael and Halel. Samael is Leviathan, is the dragon of the sea. Halel is a flying dragon that will fall to earth and become a serpent in Revelation 12. So one could see the dragon as both Samael or Halel, just like Baal also fits both of them because they both claim to be lords. So, and in that same place there was a great dragon which they of Babylon worshipped. So they had a dinosaur, and since they were not that common already, hundreds of years before Messiah, obviously they had all extinguished. They have become extinct. Yet there was, I repeat, one or two around the earth, and in this case they found one and took it to Babylon to make it a god, to worship it as a god because of his great size, of course. So it says, and the king said unto Daniel, will you also say that this is of brass? Look, he lives, he eats and drinks. You cannot say that he's no living Elohim. Therefore worship him. So the king, after seeing what happened with Baal, he starts thinking about the other god that they had. And he said, well, this one does eat. I have seen it. He lives. I have seen it. So you, Daniel, cannot say that this is not a living God, as they would say, so worship it. Then Daniel said unto the king, I will worship Yahweh my Elohim, for he is the living Elohim, the only Elohim. But give me permission, O king, and I shall slay this dragon without sword or staff. So Daniel would use his wisdom, knowing obviously that dragon was just an animal, just a huge animal whom not many people knew about because of the lack of dinosaurs back in the day. So he is going to use his wisdom to make something for this animal to eat and be killed by it. So he says, "But give me permission, O king, and I shall slay this dragon without sword or staff." The king said, "I give thee permission." Then Daniel took pitch and fat and hair, and did seethe them together, and made lumps thereof. This he put in the dragon's mouth, and so the dragon burst in sunder. And Daniel said, "Look, these are the Elohim you worship." So through what the dragon ate, he exploded pretty much from the inside and died. And then once he was killed, he told the king, "Look, this is your Elohim. He's not living anymore, is he?" So when they of Babylon heard that, they took great indignation. Instead of understanding that they were worshiping a lie and they were wrong and they should repent, they would see that as a blasphemy, as a disrespect to them, and then they would want to kill Daniel, just like it will happen with the two witnesses who will destroy the false doctrines and the idols, pretty much the image that people have of the Lord and God will be destroyed, and therefore the people will be angry with the two witnesses and will want to kill them. So when they of Babylon heard that, they took great indignation and conspired against the king, saying, "The king has become a Yahudi, and he has destroyed the Lord. He has slain the dragon and put the priests to death." So they were claiming that Cyrus had become a Yahudi, which is interesting because of what I had said earlier regarding how Cyrus represents the last who is born as the prodigal son, as a Gentile, and then realizes that he is a Yahudi. So they came to the king and said, "Deliver us Daniel, or else we will destroy you and your house." Now when the king saw that they pressed him sore, being constrained, he delivered Daniel unto them, who cast him into the lion's den, where he was 6 days. Which confirms what I was saying regarding how this will happen at the end times. And we know that the end times happen during the 6th day, or at the end of the 6th millennium, because to Yahweh 1 day are as 1,000 years. Yahweh made creation in 7 days, being the 7th day that of the rest, the Shabbat. So the day of Yahweh will be the 7th millennium, when we will rest from all evil, and everything will end at the very beginning of it, which would be the end of the 6th millennium. So that's why he was into the lion's den for 6 days. And in the den there were 7 lions, and they had given them every day 2 carcasses and 2 sheep, which then were not given to them, to the intent that they might devour Daniel. So they would feed them all the time. This time they didn't, in their heads, to make sure that they would eat Daniel. We know that Satan is like a lion, seeking whom he may devour. So it says, and in the den there were 7 lions. 7 represents completion, so there were all the lions there could be. And even with all of the power that has been given to Satan through humans' free will, they won't be able to destroy Yahweh's will and his Messiah. So in the den there were 7 lions, and they had given them every day 2 carcasses and 2 sheep, which then were not given to them, to the intent that they might devour Daniel. Now there was a Yahudi prophet called Habakkuk. Now there was a Yahudi prophet called Habakkuk, who had made pottage and had broken bread in a bowl and was going into the field to bring it to the reapers, which confirms what I was saying, because the reapers are mentioned because it represents the time of the harvest, which is at the very end, when the 1 millennium is beginning, the Shabbat, the 7th day, the day of Yahweh. So Habakkuk, as the other prophets, so Daniel and Habakkuk was bringing food to those who were harvesting, as in the end times. But the Malach of Yahweh said unto Habakkuk, Go, carry the dinner that thou hast into Babylon unto Daniel, who is in the lion's den. So Daniel was hungry, of course, after 6 days being there. It's interesting that we don't see, like many would think, this happened in the first day, for instance, or food just appearing before Daniel. Yahweh actually sends a malach to tell Habakkuk to bring the food that he has in his hands to Daniel. This confirms regarding the 2 witnesses, 2 prophets in the end times. But also the point with the reapers, showing how he's doing the time of the harvest, and also showing how Yahweh does miracles the way he decides, because of several reasons that all must be taken into account when trying to interpret what he's doing. So, but the angel of Yahweh said to Habakkuk, Go, carry the dinner that thou hast into Babylon unto Daniel, who is in the lion's den. And Habakkuk said, Yahweh, well, sovereign in this case, Adon, I never saw Babylon, neither do I know where the den is. Then the angel of Yahweh took him by the crown, and bare him by the hair of his head, and through the power of his ruach sent him in Babylon over the den. Set him in Babylon over the den. So the malach, when he heard from Habakkuk that he didn't know where Babylon was, nor the den, was taken by the malach by the hair and brought to Babylon. And I say it like that because it sounds funny, but because we see it also in the rest of scriptures regarding the prophets, when Yahweh would, through a malach, bring somebody from one place to the other in the blink of an eye, as in perhaps even like teletransportation, like disappearing and appearing, because at least how fast they would go from one place to the other because of the ability that the malachim have to do that. And the crown of the head, of course, and the hair, those who have it, represents a connection to the spirit as a extension of the nervous system. So the hair represents something that connects to the spirit. That's why women have long hair and males have beards. So it has to do with the connection to the spirit. So it is because of that the malach, in a way, through the hair would be able to transport the prophet. So it says, and bear him by the hair of his head, and through the power of his spirit set him in Babylon over the den. And Habakkuk cried, saying, O Daniel, Daniel, take the dinner which Yahweh has sent thee. Daniel, take the dinner with which Elohim has sent you. O Daniel, Daniel, take the dinner with which Elohim has sent you. And Daniel said, Thou hast remembered me, O Elohim, neither hast thou forsaken them that seek thee and love thee. So Daniel said, You have remembered me, O Yahweh, O Elohim. In this case, it's Elohim. Neither have you forsaken them that seek you and love you. So Daniel arose and did eat, and the malach of Yahweh set Habakkuk in his own place again immediately. Upon the 7th day, the king went to bewail Daniel, as in the 7th millennium, the Shabbat, when now everything will be fulfilled regarding the kingdom of Yahweh on this earth, and a time in which the witness like Moshe, represented by, well, in this case Daniel, would be resurrected, as in coming out of the den of lions, which would be Sheol. Upon the 7th day the king went to bewail Daniel, and when he came to the den, he looked in, and behold, Daniel was sitting. Then cried the king with a loud voice, saying, Great is Yahweh Elohim of Daniel, and there is none other beside you. So here we see how Cyrus came to believe in Yahweh as the only Elohim, as the true Elohim. Then cried the king with a loud voice, saying, Great art Yahweh Elohim of Daniel, and there is none other beside thee. And he drew him out, and cast those that were the cause of his destruction into the den, and they were devoured in a moment before his face. So he saw the destruction of his enemies in a moment, for the lions were very hungry, of course. They had not eaten in 7 days. And I'll see you next week. See you soon.